Hello, everyone. I'm your storyteller, here to guide you today. I know many of you use this video to unwind and drift off to sleep. So, before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know, where are you watching from and what time is it for you? Now, settle in, get cozy, and relax. Story 1. The invitation had come on a damp Wednesday evening, unannounced and unremarkable at first. James sat at his desk, staring blankly at a half-written article about urban legends when his phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a name he hadn't seen in years. Amber. Amber was relentless when it came to her hobbies, cryptid hunting chief among them. It had been over a decade since James last spoke to her, back when they were journalism interns chasing leads and conspiracy theories. But the text she sent was brief and cryptic. James, if you're still writing about legends, I've got something for you. Pacific Northwest this weekend. Bigfoot territory. You won't regret it. James scoffed, rolling his eyes. He was a journalist, not some backyard myth chaser. Yet, something gnawed at him. It wasn't just Amber's unshaken belief in things like Bigfoot. It was the mention of Pacific Northwest. He'd always heard the stories, seen the documentaries, even mocked them on occasion. But this was a chance to see it for himself. Against better judgment, he replied, "I'm in. What's the catch?" The reply came almost instantly. "No catch. Bring boots. And don't get scared." 3 days later, James found himself standing at the edge of a dirt trail outside a small town in Oregon. The sky was overcast, and the air smelled of pine and wet earth. Amber greeted him with her usual enthusiasm, her auburn hair tied back and her face glowing with excitement. "You made it," she said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Not sure why," James muttered. "This feels more like a wild goose chase than journalism." Amber's grin widened. "Oh, it's no wild goose chase. Darren's meeting us here. He's our guide. Knows these woods better than anyone." Darren arrived moments later, a hulking man with a weathered face and piercing green eyes. He carried a large pack and wore a hunting knife strapped to his belt. "You James?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. James nodded. Darren chuckled darkly. "Hope you brought a strong stomach. People go into these woods looking for legends. Sometimes they don't come back." The hike began uneventfully. The trio moved deeper into the forest, the tall evergreens casting long shadows as the sun dipped lower in the sky. Amber peppered Darren with questions about local wildlife and sightings. "A couple hikers last year saw something big and hairy near the ridge," Darren said, pointing to a rocky outcrop in the distance. "Bigger than any bear. Left tracks the size of dinner plates." James snorted. "Dinner plates? Sounds like someone's been watching too many B-movies." Darren stopped abruptly, turning to face him. "Laugh all you want, city boy, but when the sun sets out here, and you're hearing things you can't explain, don't say I didn't warn you." The weight of Darren's words hung in the air as they continued deeper into the woods. The forest seemed to grow darker and more oppressive with each step. Birds quieted, and the wind whispered through the trees like an unseen presence. By the time they reached the first campsite, the sun had vanished behind the mountains, leaving only a sliver of twilight. Darren set up a small fire while Amber unrolled sleeping bags. James stared into the encroaching darkness, feeling a growing unease. Somewhere, far off in the distance, a low, guttural howl echoed through the woods. Amber froze, her eyes meeting Darren's. That wasn't a coyote." Darren nodded grimly. "No, it wasn't." James forced a laugh, though his voice wavered. "You're telling me Bigfoot howls now?" Darren didn't reply. Instead, he leaned closer to the fire, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. "Stay close to the fire tonight," he said. "And don't wander. This forest doesn't like strangers." James felt a chill run down his spine, the kind of cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. He tried to tell himself it was just an old hunter superstition, but as the howl echoed again, louder this time, he wasn't so sure anymore. The morning arrived slowly, the pale light filtering through the dense canopy above. James awoke to the sound of Darren stirring the fire back to life. Amber was already up, crouching near the edge of the campsite with a camera in hand. "What are you doing?" James asked groggily, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. Amber didn't turn around. "Tracks," she said, her voice tinged with excitement. "Big ones." James rolled his eyes but grabbed his jacket and walked over. Darren joined them, holding a thermos of coffee. "Look at this," Amber said, pointing to the ground. "Tea first." James didn't see it. Then the shape emerged. A massive, elongated footprint sunk deep into the soil. It was nearly twice the size of his own foot, with 5 clearly defined toes. Darren crouched down, running his fingers over the edges of the print. "Fresh," he muttered. "Whatever made this came through here last night." James frowned. "Probably just a bear." Amber shot him a sharp look. "A bear with feet like this? You're the journalist. Shouldn't you be more curious?" "I am curious," James replied, crouching beside Darren. "Curious how you two don't see this as some elaborate prank." Darren stood, his expression grim. "Bears don't leave prints like that, and they sure as hell don't walk on 2 legs." Amber snapped a few pictures and followed the line of prints deeper into the woods. "Come on," she said over her shoulder. "Let's see where they lead." The tracks led them away from the campsite, weaving through thick underbrush and around towering trees. The forest seemed quieter than before, as if the usual sounds of nature had retreated. James checked his watch. They'd been following the trail for nearly an hour when Amber stopped abruptly. "Look," she whispered, pointing ahead. In the soft earth near a small stream. The footprints ended. But something else caught James's eye. Tufts of dark, matted hair caught on the bark of a tree. Darren stepped forward, examining the hair closely. "Definitely not bear," he said. "Too coarse. Too long." Amber took a sample, sealing in a plastic bag. "This could be evidence," she said, her voice brimming with excitement. James, however, felt uneasy. He scanned the surrounding trees, his journalist instincts screaming that something wasn't right. "Why would it stop here?" he asked. "If it's a trail, shouldn't there be more prints on the other side of the stream?" Darren frowned, looking across the water. The opposite bank was undisturbed. No footprints, no signs of passage. "It's like it just disappeared," Amber said softly. James didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the dense woods beyond the stream. For a moment, he thought he saw movement, something large shifting between the trees. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice low. Amber turned to him. "See what?" James hesitated. "I don't know. Maybe nothing." Darren's hand rested on his knife. "Let's head back to camp. We're not the only ones out here." As they retraced their steps, James couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, set his nerves on edge. "Relax," Amber said, noticing his unease. "If anything, we're getting closer to the truth. Or closer to something we don't want to find," James muttered. When they finally reached the campsite, Darren immediately began reinforcing the perimeter, stacking rocks and tying rope between trees. "Is that really necessary?" James asked. Darren didn't look up. "Out here, you prepare for the worst, especially when you're dealing with something you don't understand." Amber ignored the tension and began reviewing her photos. James, however, couldn't sit still. He paced the edge of the camp, staring into the forest as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground. The same low howl from the previous night echoed through the trees. This time, it was closer. The forest came alive as the howl subsided, an eerie symphony of rustling leaves and distant snaps echoing through the trees. James stood frozen at the edge of the camp, his eyes scanning the darkening woods. Darren, ever vigilant, moved to his side. "Stay close to the fire," he said, gripping the hilt of his knife. "It's smarter than you think. Won't charge unless it's sure it has the upper hand." James turned to him, incredulous. "You're seriously suggesting it's out there, stalking us?" Darren's face was grave. "You heard it. Tell me that's something you've encountered before." Amber joined them, clutching her camera like a talisman. "We need to record this," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "No," Darren snapped. "You need to stay alive. Cameras won't save you if it decides to come closer." The fire cast flickering shadows across the campsite as night fell. James, Amber, and Darren huddled close, their conversation reduced to hushed whispers. "Tell me the truth," James said finally. "You've seen it before, haven't you?" Darren stared into the flames for a long moment before answering. Once, years ago, I was hunting with my brother just north of here. We found tracks like the ones we saw today, but bigger, deeper, like something heavy had walked through mud that should have swallowed it whole. Amber leaned in, her curiosity piqued. And we followed them, Darren continued. Thought it was a bear at first, but when we caught sight of it, his voice trailed off, and he shook his head. What did you see? James pressed. It wasn't a bear, Darren said simply, and it wasn't afraid of us. Stood upright, watching us like we were the ones trespassing. James shivered despite the fire's warmth. So what happened? Darren's jaw tightened. We left. Didn't run, didn't turn our backs. Just backed away slowly until we were far enough to bolt. My brother never spoke of it again, and I don't hunt alone anymore. Amber was about to ask another question when a sharp crack pierced the night. It wasn't the sound of a falling branch. It was deliberate, like something stepping on wood. Darren rose silently, motioning for the others to stay quiet. He scanned the tree lean, his hand on the hilt of his knife. The snapping sounds grew closer, interspersed with heavy, deliberate breathing. James's heart pounded as he strained his ears, trying to locate the source. Over there, Amber whispered, pointing to a cluster of trees. At first, James saw nothing. Then, two faintly glowing orbs appeared, eyes reflecting the firelight. They were set far apart, too high off the ground to belong to any normal animal. Jesus Christ, James muttered, his voice barely audible. Amber fumbled for her camera, but Darren grabbed her wrist. Don't, he hissed. You'll provoke it. The eyes didn't move for a long moment, staring unblinkingly at the group. Then, with a low, guttural growl, they vanished into the darkness. What do we do? Amber whispered, her voice trembling. We wait, Darren said, his tone firm. It's testing us. If we panic, it'll take advantage. James couldn't believe what he was hearing. Are you seriously telling me this thing is smart enough to play mind games? Darren didn't reply. Instead, he threw another log onto the fire, sending sparks into the air. Fire keeps most things at bay, he said, but not forever. Hours passed with no further signs of the creature. James tried to convince himself that the glowing eyes were a trick of the light, but the memory refused to fade. As the fire began to die down, Darren stood. We need more wood, he said. You're not seriously going out there, James said. I'll be quick, Darren replied. Stay here and keep the fire going. Amber protested, but Darren silenced her with a look. If it comes back, you'll need the fire. Trust me. Reluctantly, they watched as Darren disappeared into the darkness, his flashlight cutting through the trees. James and Amber sat in tense silence, listening for any sign of their guide or the creature. Every rustle of leaves, every distant snap of a twig made their hearts race. When Darren finally returned, his face was pale and his hands were shaking. What happened? Amber asked. He dropped the wood by the fire and sat heavily. It's closer than we thought, he said. I saw its silhouette, watching me. James felt the chill return, sharper this time. And you just walked away? Darren met his gaze, his expression unreadable. It let me. The night deepened, and the oppressive silence of the forest seemed to grow heavier with every passing minute. The fire crackled, sending faint shadows dancing across the trees, but its light felt insufficient against the encroaching darkness. Amber fidgeted with her camera, glancing nervously toward Darren, who was sharpening his knife with deliberate precision. James sat beside her, trying to appear calm, but failing miserably. This is insane, James said finally, his voice breaking the silence. We're sitting ducks out here. We should pack up and leave. Amber shook her head. And hike out of here in the dark? That's asking for trouble. Darren's voice cut through their argument. She's right. Leaving now would be suicide. It knows these woods better than we ever could. We wouldn't make a mile. James threw up his hands in frustration. So what? We just wait for it to make the first move. Darren met his gaze. That's exactly what we do. A sharp whistle pierced the night, followed by another crack of branches. This time, the sound wasn't distant. It came from multiple directions, as if something, or several somethings, were circling the camp. Amber froze. Did you hear that? Stay calm. Darren ordered, rising slowly to his feet. He scanned the perimeter, his knife gleaming in the firelight. James stood as well, his pulse pounding in his ears. "It's not just one, is it?" Darren didn't answer. Instead, he motioned for them to stand back near the fire. "Keep the flames high," he said. "They're testing us." Amber clutched James's arm. She whispered, her voice trembling. James looked at Darren, his stomach sinking. "You're saying there's more than one?" Before Darren could reply, a low growl rumbled from the shadows, followed by another and another. The sounds were guttural, alien, and terrifyingly close. Amber aimed her camera toward the noise and snapped a photo. The flash illuminated the forest for a brief moment, and James caught a glimpse of something massive moving between the trees, something covered in dark, matted fur. "Oh my God," Amber whispered, lowering the camera. Darren growled, "I told you not to do that." The growling stopped abruptly, replaced by a chilling silence. The trio stood motionless, fire crackling the only sound. Then came the sound of something heavy hitting the ground, a large rock, landing just feet from the fire. "They're throwing rocks now?" James asked, his voice rising in panic. Darren picked up the stone, examining it. Not a warning, a challenge. Amber's voice was shaky. "What do we do?" "Stand our ground," Darren replied. "Show fear, and they'll take it as an invitation." Another rock sailed into the campsite, landing dangerously close to Amber. She let out a small cry, and Darren barked, "No screaming. Stay calm." James felt his legs trembling but forced himself to stay still. "This isn't normal animal behavior," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "No," Darren agreed. "It's not." For what felt like hours, the group endured the eerie game of cat and mouse. Rocks continued to land closer and closer, and the growls would rise and fall, as if the creatures were communicating. Then came the breaking point. A massive figure emerged from the shadows, standing just outside the firelight. It was easily 8 feet tall, its broad shoulders hunched and its glowing eyes fixed on them. Amber gasped, raising her camera again, but Darren grabbed her arm. "Don't!" he hissed. James couldn't look away. The creature was unlike anything he'd ever seen. Part man, part beast, its body covered in thick, dark fur. Its hands, if they could be called that, ended in long, claw-like fingers. He stepped forward, letting out a guttural snarl that sent a wave of primal fear through James's body. Darren stepped between the group and the creature, holding his knife aloft. "Stay back," he said firmly, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. The creature tilted its head, studying him. Then, as if in response, another figure emerged from the opposite side of the camp. "Oh no," Amber whispered, James's breath caught in his throat. There were 2 of them now, both massive, both watching with unsettling intelligence. "We're surrounded," Darren muttered. Amber clutched James's arm tightly. "What do we do?" Darren's voice was low but resolute. "Pray the fire holds them off." The 2 towering figures stood at the edges of the firelight, their glowing eyes fixed on the trio with a predatory intensity. James's heart hammered in his chest as the firelight flickered, casting fleeting shadows on the encircling woods. He felt a crushing weight of helplessness, pinned between fight and flight. "They're waiting for something," Darren said quietly, his grip on the knife tightening. "Stay close to the fire and don't make any sudden moves." Amber was trembling, her camera dangling uselessly from her hands. "What could they possibly be waiting for?" she whispered. "An opening," Darren replied grimly. The larger of the 2 creatures growled deeply, a guttural sound that seemed to vibrate through the air. It took a step closer, and James instinctively moved back, bumping into Amber. The second creature circled to the left, staying just outside the reach of the firelight. James turned to Darren, panic bubbling in his voice. "We can't just stand here. We need to do something." Darren held up a hand to silence him. "They're testing us. Don't give them what they want." Amber's voice quivered. "And if they stop testing and start attacking?" Darren didn't answer, his attention locked on a larger figure. It crouched slightly, its massive arms swaying like a predator preparing to strike. Suddenly, it let out a bone-chilling roar and lunged forward, stopping just short of the fire. Amber screamed, and James staggered back, nearly tripping over his own feet. Darren stepped forward, thrusting the knife in its direction. "Back!" he shouted, his voice commanding and sharp. The creature recoiled slightly, its glowing eyes narrowing as it let out another growl. From behind, the second creature let out a high-pitched whistle, and the first responded with a series of grunts. "They're communicating," Amber said, her voice barely audible. "Of course they are," Darren muttered. "These aren't just animals, they're strategists." James couldn't believe what he was hearing. Strategists? They're monsters, Darren. They're going to kill us. Not if we stay smart, Darren snapped. Fear is their weapon. Don't give it to them. But James was beyond reasoning. He grabbed a burning branch from the fire, holding it like a makeshift torch. "Stay back," he shouted, waving the branch toward the creatures. The larger one flinched slightly at the sudden movement, but didn't retreat. Instead, it let out a guttural snarl, baring its jagged teeth. "James, stop!" Darren barked. "You're provoking it." James ignored him, taking a step toward the creature. "You want to fight? Come on." The second creature took the opportunity to dart closer, its massive form moving with unnerving speed. Amber screamed as it reached the edge of the firelight, its eyes locked on her. Darren reacted instantly, throwing his knife with precision. The blade sank into the creature's shoulder, and it let out a deafening roar of pain. First creature, enraged, charged forward, swiping at James with its massive arm. He barely managed to dodge, the branch slipping from his grasp and landing in the dirt. "Get back to the fire!" Darren shouted, grabbing another burning log and swinging it at the creature. Flames made the creature hesitate, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it stood its ground, snarling and pacing just beyond the flames. Amber was sobbing, clutching her camera as if it could somehow protect her. "We're going to die out here," she whimpered. "No, we're not," Darren said firmly, his voice cutting through the chaos. "As long as we keep the fire strong, we have a chance." James scrambled back to the safety of the fire, his hands shaking. "That thing almost killed me," he said, his voice trembling. "And it will if you keep acting like an idiot," Darren shot back. The second creature had retreated slightly, clutching its wounded shoulder, but its glowing eyes still burned with rage. The larger one let out a deafening roar, slamming its massive fists into the ground. The force sent vibrations through the earth, making the fire flicker dangerously. "We need a plan," Amber said through her tears. "We can't just sit here waiting for them to break through." Darren's eyes were steely. "We hold out until dawn. They're nocturnal hunters. They'll retreat when the sun rises." James glanced at the sky, his heart sinking. The horizon was still pitch black, the faintest hint of dawn hours away. "I hope we survive that long," he muttered, his voice barely audible.